This Boy's Life, 1993, arrives not as a spectacle of effects or grand cinematic gestures, but as a film where the technology is felt in subtler, quieter ways. Everything in it leans toward the naturalistic, toward grounding the story in a lived-in reality that reflects the world of its characters. It is not a film that relies on machinery to overwhelm the senses, but rather one that uses the mechanics of its craft, its lenses, its sound, its light, to place the viewer inside the small, often suffocating spaces of a family struggling with change. The technology is always in service of tone, never drawing attention to itself, yet impossible to ignore once you begin to notice how precisely it has been employed. The story is told through images that feel immediate and close. The camera seems to know when to settle, when to hold, when to pull back just far enough to let you see the room pressing in around a character. The technology here is quiet, as if designed to disappear into the fabric of the narrative. But the stillness of a shot, the grain of the film, the way light falls against a face, these choices come together to create an atmosphere that cannot be separated from the machinery used to capture it. It is a film that trusts its tools not to shout, but to whisper. One of the first things that stands out is the texture of its visual world. Every frame has a tactile quality, as though you could reach out and feel the worn wood of a staircase or the faded fabric of a sofa. That texture is not accidental, it is the result of careful control of cameras and stock, of choosing angles and exposures that amplify the roughness of life. In moments where the young boy sits quietly, caught between dreams and disappointment, the grain itself seems to echo his unease. The technology ensures that nothing looks too polished, too distant. Everything remains grounded, touched by imperfection. Light is treated with the same care. Interiors are often dim, their illumination uneven, with lamps casting long shadows and daylight filtering weakly through thin curtains. This is not the bright, open glow of fantasy. It is a light that narrows space, a light that isolates. It makes a kitchen feel smaller, a living room more oppressive. Outside, sunlight can feel harsh, exposing flaws rather than offering clarity. This treatment of light is a technological decision as much as an artistic one, the result of choices made in how to capture contrast, how to balance what is hidden and what is revealed. Sound carries its own weight. The film does not drown in sweeping music or constant cues. Instead, it leans into the quiet hum of domestic life. You hear the creak of floorboards, the slam of a door, the muffled sound of voices rising in another room. Every small detail is amplified by the way it has been recorded and mixed, turning ordinary noises into constant reminders of tension. When tempers flare, the sound cuts sharper, filling space with anger. When silence descends, the absence of sound becomes almost unbearable. Technology here does not overwhelm. It shapes silence and noise into something visceral. Editing moves with restraint, letting moments breathe rather than rushing them. Cuts are timed to mirror the rhythm of life in a home where conflict simmers below the surface. At times, the camera lingers just long enough to make you feel trapped, unable to look away from discomfort. At others, it shifts quickly, reflecting the volatility of a scene about to erupt. This rhythm is guided by both human intuition and mechanical precision, a balance of instinct and tool that defines how the film is experienced. Costumes and sets are another layer of technology, though often overlooked. Wardrobe choices are not flashy, but each piece of clothing speaks to era and circumstance. Jackets look worn, shoes scuffed, dresses faded. Nothing is pristine, and that attention to wear gives the story its grounding. Sets feel equally lived in, every corner filled with the small details of real life. Dishes stacked unevenly, paint chipped on doorframes, old photographs propped on shelves. These are decisions created by design departments, but they rely on the tools of filmmaking to capture them with fidelity. The technology in this sense acts as an archivist, preserving the reality of objects so they carry emotional weight. The pacing of the story would not resonate as it does without the way these tools are harnessed. The movement of a camera through a room, the subtle change of focus as one face is emphasized over another, the choice to let silence dominate a moment rather than filling it with score, these are all technological interventions, yet they feel invisible. They are the framework on which the story is built, the invisible machinery that makes emotions resonate without needing to announce themselves. In its performances, too, the technology plays a quiet but decisive role. Every close-up, every pause, every fleeting glance is preserved with clarity. The tools make sure that nothing is lost, that the smallest tremor in a face or hesitation in a voice can be felt. It is easy to take this for granted, to assume that performance alone carries these emotions, but the truth is that without the sensitivity of the tools, without their ability to capture fragility without distortion, so much of that power would be dulled. The film also benefits from its restraint in spectacle. There are no elaborate sequences of destruction, no towering special effects to distract from the human scale of the drama. Instead, the tools are focused inward, on intimacy. This is where the technology achieves its greatest strength. By refusing excess, it forces the audience to sit with small details, to absorb the weight of looks, silences, and gestures. It proves that technology need not always be loud to be effective. Sometimes its greatest achievement is to disappear, leaving behind only the pulse of the story. Yet even in its restraint, the film never feels lifeless. The flow of scenes, the way tension builds and recedes, the shaping of sound and image, all of these come together into a rhythm that feels alive. This vitality is not the product of chance but of control, of using the available tools with care. Each decision reflects a commitment to authenticity, to presenting life as it feels rather than as it might be idealized. The technology becomes a partner in this pursuit, bending toward truth rather than artifice. When conflict erupts, the tools respond in kind. The camera grows restless, sound sharpens, editing fractures into shorter beats. The technology mirrors emotion, embodying anger and volatility. When calm returns, the tools settle, creating contrast that makes the violence of the previous moment feel all the more jarring. In this way, the machinery of cinema becomes a reflection of the characters themselves, changing in tone and rhythm to embody their shifting states. The modesty of the film's technical approach is what gives it strength. Nothing is wasted, nothing overplayed. Every choice, from the grain of the image to the hiss of silence, serves the story. This is why the film continues to resonate, not because it overwhelms, but because it lingers. Its technology is felt as atmosphere, as texture, as an invisible hand guiding the viewer through lives marked by longing, disappointment, and fleeting moments of hope. As the story moves toward its end, the technology never loosens its grip on restraint. The final images remain grounded, intimate, refusing to offer escape into fantasy. The audience is left with the same world they began in, scarred but familiar, carried by the same hum of everyday sounds and the same dim light that has filled every room. It is a reminder that technology in cinema is not always about invention or spectacle. Sometimes its greatest gift is fidelity, the ability to hold up a mirror to the smallness of human life and make it feel significant. And so this film endures as a quiet showcase of what tools can do when wielded with care. Its lenses and microphones, its lights and edits, its costumes and sets, all combine to create an experience that is as much about feeling as it is about seeing. In the end, the technology does not distract from the human story, it allows it to exist with clarity, depth, and weight. It becomes invisible not because it is absent, but because it is so perfectly aligned with the truth it seeks to capture. What lingers most as the film settles into memory is how every technical choice contributes to its atmosphere of confinement. The close quarters of kitchens, bedrooms, and porches do not require elaborate production design. They require the ability to make those spaces feel suffocating on screen. The camera achieves this not through wide, indulgent sweeps but by holding close, by pushing against faces, by capturing the walls pressing in. The audience feels trapped alongside the characters, forced to breathe in their silence and endure their tension. That sensation is no accident. It is the culmination of careful technological orchestration. There is a rhythm to the visual design that mirrors the emotional arc of the story. Early scenes breathe a little more, with compositions that allow space and light to suggest possibility. Yet as conflict grows, that space collapses. Rooms look smaller, framing tightens, the lens seems to narrow in, stripping away escape routes. Even in moments of quiet, The visuals maintain a subtle pressure. The technology behind these shifts never calls attention to itself, but it directs emotion in ways the audience feels without consciously naming. Sound operates with equal intention. The creak of old wood, the slam of a screen door, the scrape of a chair against the floor, these noises echo longer than they should, as if the walls themselves were amplifying discontent. Dialogue is captured with a sharpness that exposes every crack in a voice, every hesitation, every suppressed fury. When laughter does break out, it sounds brittle, edged with unease. The way these sounds are captured and arranged makes the world feel fragile, a space where even small noises carry weight. It is technology functioning not as decoration but as atmosphere, giving every sound an emotional charge. The film's color palette adds another layer. Muted tones dominate, with earth shades and faded fabrics creating an aesthetic that feels worn, lived in, even tired. Nothing gleams, nothing shines. This choice reinforces the sense of struggle. Clothes look washed thin, furniture feels secondhand, rooms lack the brightness of promise. The technology of color reproduction becomes storytelling here, turning the everyday into a visual echo of the characters' lives. It does not romanticize, it insists on realism. Editing plays the role of pulse. The timing of cuts mirrors the volatility of the household. When tempers simmer, the camera holds, forcing the viewer to sit inside discomfort. When anger erupts, cuts accelerate, reflecting the jagged rhythm of violence. This manipulation of time through technology transforms the film from a simple narrative into an experience of tension itself. The viewer is not only watching conflict, they are feeling its rhythm in the pacing of the edit. The performances are captured with such intimacy that the camera becomes almost confessional. The smallest gestures are not lost. The twitch of an eye, the tightening of a jaw, the slump of a shoulder. Technology here serves as witness, ensuring that the fragility of performance survives the translation from actor to screen. Without that sensitivity, the story would lose its power. Instead, the machinery makes vulnerability visible, insisting that the viewer notice what might otherwise be missed. Outside spaces are used sparingly but with purpose. Roads, schoolyards, and stretches of sky appear, but they never promise liberation. Instead, they emphasize distance. The world beyond the home feels unreachable, more imagined than attainable. The way these spaces are shot, often with stark contrasts of light, makes them appear both vast and indifferent. Technology captures this coldness, turning the outside world into another form of confinement, not by walls, but by indifference. Music, when it appears, is restrained. It supports rather than dictates, offering subtle undercurrents instead of overwhelming swells. The sparseness of score allows silence to dominate, which in turn makes sound design more powerful. When music rises, it feels earned, like a breath released after suffocation. This restraint speaks to a philosophy of technology in the film: never to distract, always to heighten. The tactile quality of production design reinforces everything else. Objects carry history: scratched tables, dented pots, worn clothing. These details, captured faithfully by the lens, remind the audience that lives are layered in use and wear. Technology's role here is preservation. It ensures that the small histories of these objects, their imperfections and scars, are not lost. When a character slams a fist on a table, the scratch marks already etch their add to the violence, telling their own silent story. Moments of stillness are perhaps the film's greatest achievement. The camera holds on a face after dialogue ends, capturing silence as it thickens. These pauses feel longer than comfort allows, and technology ensures that every second resonates. Grain becomes texture, silence becomes sound, the image becomes a weight pressing on the viewer. In these moments, the film teaches us that technology does not need to move fast or loud to be powerful, it needs only to be patient. The relationship between characters is framed as much by technical choices as by performance. The positioning of the camera often places the boy lower in the frame, dwarfed by walls or by the looming presence of adults. Angles exaggerate imbalance, giving the audience a constant sense of vulnerability. Technology here becomes visual metaphor, reminding us that power is not only spoken but spatial, encoded in where the lens chooses to stand. Even the way rooms are lit contributes to storytelling. Lamps flicker unevenly, shadows carve faces into halves, sunlight falls in harsh stripes through blinds. The technology of lighting captures this contrast, turning ordinary illumination into a portrait of tension. Rooms that might otherwise feel warm are rendered oppressive, rooms that could be neutral become threatening. Light does not soothe here, it exposes, isolates, and unsettles. Every layer of the film is touched by the same philosophy: authenticity through restraint. No tool is overused, no effect is indulged for its own sake. Everything bends toward grounding, toward realism. The technology does not create fantasy, it captures texture. It does not distract with spectacle, it insists on presence. By staying small, by staying close, it creates a story that resonates far beyond its modest means. In its closing moments, the film does not abandon this approach. It remains grounded, intimate, refusing grand resolution. The same tools that framed conflict now frame aftermath, with the same quiet patience and fidelity. The audience is left not with fireworks but with silence, not with spectacle but with weight. This is the film's achievement, to use technology not as distraction but as truth. And so its legacy lies in the quiet mastery of tools wielded with care. Lenses that see fragility, microphones that capture silence, lights that turn safety into threat, edits that shape emotion, sets that preserve imperfection. The machinery of cinema is everywhere in the film, yet it disappears, dissolving into the fabric of the story until only atmosphere remains. This is technology at its most powerful, not when it announces itself, but when it allows humanity to emerge unfiltered, raw, and unforgettable. The film feels modest in its reach, built not to overwhelm but to capture the claustrophobic weight of a boy's world reshaped by the forces around him. On screen, that modesty translates into choices that hug the characters close, keeping settings limited and tangible. There is no attempt to stretch into spectacle or invent vast backdrops. The story lives in living rooms, kitchens, classrooms, and highways that look and feel worn with use. That scale was likely intentional from the very beginning, a decision to focus resources on authenticity rather than ambition. The mood it creates is one of intimacy, where the absence of grandeur forces every look, every silence, every small eruption of anger or tenderness to carry the full weight of drama. To keep the narrative grounded, attention was concentrated on a handful of locations. Homes form the backbone of the story, not decorated to impress but to reveal where age and unease. You can sense that much of the film's energy went into getting these details right, making every chipped wall and worn chair feel like it belonged to a family scraping by. The road also plays its part, capturing long stretches of travel that echo the constant drifting of lives without anchor. These places did not require sprawling sets or intricate construction. They demanded careful scouting, measured design, and a commitment to framing the ordinary as significant. The effect is a world that looks lived in, not manufactured, as though the cameras simply slipped into a life already unfolding. The scale dictated how time and effort were distributed day to day. Performances became the centerpiece. Scenes linger on faces, draw out conversations, and lean into stillness. That meant the people in front of the camera bore more responsibility than spectacle ever could. Days on set would have been shaped around capturing nuances in expression, waiting for small shifts in tone that define the entire mood of a scene. The work was not about resetting explosions or managing elaborate stunts. It was about creating space for actors to settle into silence, to reveal tension through restraint. Such a focus likely shifted morale, keeping attention tight, demanding patience, and rewarding precision over speed. Early creative decisions about scope shaped everything that followed. By choosing to keep the story tethered to domestic spaces and a few select exteriors, the filmmakers locked themselves into a chamber-like narrative. This narrowing of scope amplified intensity, but it also limited escape routes for variety. Once those spaces were chosen, the rest of production had to adapt. The sets needed to be detailed enough to sustain long, quiet scenes. Lighting had to change a room's mood over time without altering its basic identity. Editing had to pace repetitions in a way that kept familiar places fresh. That initial commitment to scale meant every department leaned into subtlety, finding variation within limits rather than relying on scope for variety. The scale also influenced how resources were deployed behind the camera. Instead of building massive crews to wrangle complicated effects, the emphasis would have fallen on smaller, tighter teams able to work within confined environments. Crews had to move quickly in cramped spaces, keeping equipment minimal so as not to crowd out actors or overwhelm the natural feel of a location. This practical constraint shaped the look of the film, making shots feel immediate and uncluttered. Tools were used sparingly, their presence hidden, so that the machinery of production never overpowered the lived reality the film sought to capture. On set, the pressure of this size carried its own weight. When everything depends on performance, when spectacle cannot distract from flaws, there is little margin for error. Each take mattered because each scene had to carry emotional truth with no adornment to mask shortcomings. That pressure would have been felt by everyone, from actors adjusting the smallest inflections, to directors weighing whether silence or dialogue served better, to crews ensuring sound and light never intruded on fragile moments. The scale, though small in ambition, intensified responsibility. In a story told through subtleties, every detail mattered more. What emerged from this approach was a rhythm shaped by the project's size. Days were likely spent in repetition, shooting in the same rooms from new angles, layering new emotions into familiar walls. Such repetition can be exhausting, but it also breeds intimacy, binding cast and crew into the spaces they occupy. Morale would have swayed between fatigue at the confinement and pride in the precision such confinement allowed. Turning plans into scenes meant carving drama from silence, tension from the ordinary, and weight from gestures so small they could be missed without the right attention. The scale made this both a challenge and a triumph, forcing the entire team to sharpen their focus on the human core of the story to be wise staying modest. By choosing intimacy over spectacle, the production shaped itself into something both demanding and enduring. The limited scope did not feel like absence. It felt like insistence, a deliberate refusal to dilute the personal with the grand. That refusal defined every decision: where to place light, how to cut dialogue, when to let silence breathe. It is in these choices that the true scale of the project is revealed, not in size but in weight, not in excess but in concentration. The result is a film that lives entirely in its characters, captured through tools and decisions that bent themselves toward honesty rather than show. Support for the film felt as though it grew in waves, carried forward by a faith in the story's intimacy rather than by promises of grandeur. In its earliest moments, when the project was still an idea being weighed, that faith must have rested on conviction in performances and atmosphere. The material itself carried weight, the kind of personal, character-driven narrative that demanded belief before proof. Those who came forward first likely did so on the strength of tone, trusting that a story told in rooms, cars, and fractured households could find its power without needing spectacle. The first impressions emphasized faces more than spectacle. Posters, articles, and early stills leaned into the expressions of its central figures, making it clear that this was a film about human struggle rather than external thrills. That choice of presentation shaped the kind of audience it drew in. Those looking for intimacy, for the sting of reality on screen, found themselves leaning closer. As word began to circulate, the conversation turned not to effects or set pieces but to performances and tone. That in itself was a signal. The film was finding its fit with viewers who valued nuance, who were willing to sit with discomfort, who were drawn to stories about people rather than events. As small signals accumulated, confidence began to grow inside the team. Early press carried cautious but genuine recognition of the film's strengths. The mention of strong performances surfaced again and again, and that repetition started to shape a narrative larger than the production could craft alone. Anticipation was no longer built on the hope of being noticed, it was built on the reality that people were already noticing, already speaking about what worked. For the filmmakers, these signs must have felt like pieces clicking into place, proof that their restraint had not been misread but was, in fact, the very quality audiences were responding to. Still, uncertainty lingered, as it always does before release. No amount of internal belief or positive signals can erase the unpredictability of how a film will land once it leaves the hands of those who made it. The waiting period, when everything has been completed yet nothing is known, must have been a stretch of alternating calm and tension. On some days, there would have been reassurance, strong articles, favorable mentions, encouraging previews. On others, the silence in between responses would have fed doubt. That rhythm of hope and hesitation colored the atmosphere in those final weeks, the lived experience of standing on the edge without yet knowing if the leap would land safely. For potential viewers, the film's identity presented itself clearly. It never disguised what it was or reached beyond its means. Its story was framed as grounded, intimate, rooted in the recognizable struggles of family and personal growth. The imagery leaned into authenticity rather than glamour. The tone of its publicity echoed the very mood of the film, thoughtful, heavy at times, but always anchored in humanity. In this way, marketing did not create an identity so much as reflect one, holding up a mirror to the film itself and asking audiences to look in. That alignment between presentation and essence is what ultimately shaped awareness. There were no grand promises that could not be kept, no attempts to pretend at spectacle. Instead, there was a steady insistence on truth, on authenticity, on performance. By the time audiences sat down to watch, they already had a sense of the world they were entering, one defined not by scale but by emotional honesty. The film's awareness campaign, subtle though it was, carried the same confidence that guided its production, the belief that small, precise choices can leave a deeper mark than loud, scattered gestures. The first weekend felt less like an explosion than a quiet test of faith. Those who had carried the film from page to screen knew from the start that it was not designed to storm into every corner of the marketplace. Its ambitions were subtler, measured not in volume but in depth. When the doors finally opened and the earliest viewers sat down to watch, the team waited with a nervous calm, aware that the response would tell them not just about numbers but about the kind of life the film might have in the weeks ahead. It was a moment of temperature-taking, a check on whether the intimacy of the story would be enough to pull audiences toward it rather than push them away. Inside the team, the air must have felt heavy with both relief and tension. Relief because, after months of preparation, the film was no longer theoretical, it was alive in theaters, on screens, in conversations. Tension because that aliveness carried risk. Early signals trickled in slowly, in the form of first reactions and scattered notes from those who had chosen to see it on its opening days. The quiet expectation was not for sudden dominance, but for proof that there was a space for this kind of story, that audiences were willing to give themselves over to performances, silences, and the hard edges of domestic conflict. Those first conversations from viewers mattered more than any chart could. People left theaters speaking of the weight of performances, of the discomfort of certain scenes, of the way the film refused to soften the edges of its characters. This kind of chatter did not sweep through crowds like thunder. It spread more like smoke, drifting, lingering, difficult to pin down but unmistakable in presence. The team watching these early ripples would have felt both gratitude and caution. Gratitude because the film was being spoken about with seriousness, caution because seriousness does not always translate into wide embrace. The path forward began to take shape through these murmurs. The earliest audiences hinted at a film that would not vanish after a weekend, but would instead find its momentum in persistence, in the kind of steady presence that character-driven dramas often rely on. The word from those who attended was that it was not easy viewing, but it was worth sitting with. That was both blessing and risk. On one hand, it positioned the film as something with lasting value, capable of drawing in thoughtful viewers week by week. On the other, it meant that expansion would be careful, dependent on steady hands rather than sudden waves. On the inside, balancing vision with practicality must have been its own daily negotiation. The director may have wanted to linger longer in certain scenes, to allow more time for silence or for gestures to register, but schedules would have pressed against that desire. Performers may have wanted to explore multiple shades of a moment, yet the practical limits of time and space demanded choices. The crew, too, would have felt this balance, lighting a scene for intimacy while knowing that resources required them to move quickly, framing carefully in small rooms while working around equipment crammed into corners. Each day carried this tension between vision and the boundaries imposed by reality. That balance is visible in the final film. Every moment feels deliberate, carved from compromise, sharpened by necessity. The ambition of emotional truth is always present, yet never at the cost of clarity. The story remains readable because scope was controlled, because excess was trimmed, because restraint became a tool rather than a limitation. What might have been sprawling instead became precise. What might have been diffuse instead became concentrated. In this, the film's creative scope and constraints did not weaken it. They defined it, giving it the intensity and focus that make it endure. Distribution for this film always felt carefully measured, aligned with the intimate scale of the story rather than chasing reach that might drown its subtleties. From the beginning, it was clear this was not designed as a sweeping spectacle meant to saturate every market at once. It was built as a character piece, meant to move through channels where audiences would be receptive to its quiet power. The release carried the same restraint as the film itself, a pacing that allowed word-of-mouth and performance-driven recognition to take root rather than banking on noise and excess. The way it found its audience seemed to mirror the rhythm of the story. Early momentum was modest, almost hesitant, but once people began to feel the pull of its performances, confidence grew. The distribution path reflected this, leaning into selective placement, focusing on environments where drama of this kind could resonate most strongly. This gave the film room to breathe, just as the camera had given space to silences and long glances. There was no pressure to explode immediately. The rhythm was more patient, unfolding with the same deliberate pacing that defined the narrative. What also shaped the release was the understanding that its strength lay in intimacy. A story so tied to performances and atmosphere benefits more from audiences leaning in close than from being swept up in scale. The distribution respected that truth, building carefully, leaning on the authenticity of the material and the growing reputation of those at its center. Instead of being drowned by spectacle elsewhere, it stood apart as a quieter offering, the kind that lingers in memory after the credits roll. Revenue followed a similar path, steady rather than explosive, grounded in consistency rather than peaks. The film was not built to chase sudden windfalls. It was structured to recoup patiently, carried by the faith that strong acting and word of mouth would sustain it. This rhythm of return mirrored the same balance that had carried it through production. Just as the cast and crew had worked within constraints, turning patience into strength, the release strategy did the same, letting the story's weight carry it over time rather than trying to force impact immediately. For those inside the project, this must have carried a certain relief. The pressure to deliver everything at once was replaced by the understanding that this was a long game, that the story's resonance would find its place if it was given the right shape. That atmosphere of patience shaped morale differently than a rushed spectacle might have. Instead of anxiety over immediate numbers, there was room to focus on legacy, on how the film would be remembered. This sense of endurance rather than flash became the measure of its success. Distribution also shaped perception in more subtle ways. By not stretching beyond its natural reach, the film avoided the fate of being mismatched with audiences expecting grandeur. Instead, it landed where it belonged, in spaces where intimacy, character, and tone could be appreciated. The measured rollout ensured that its identity remained intact, that it was seen for what it was rather than mistaken for something it never tried to be. In this way, the rhythm of its release echoed the creative decisions that defined it: restraint, precision, and clarity of purpose. Revenue in this light becomes more than numbers on a page. It becomes a reflection of how carefully the film balanced its choices. What it earned was proportionate to what it aimed for. There was no illusion of scale beyond its means, no chasing of spectacle, only a steady alignment between ambition and result. For those who carried it from plan to screen, this must have felt like vindication, proof that restraint can still yield reward, that patience can still build legacy, that a film need not overwhelm to endure. Awareness of the film began quietly, the kind of presence that does not arrive with fireworks but with a steady pulse, building a mood long before audiences set foot in a theater. Its placement on the calendar mattered. It came at a time when viewers were ready to absorb a story smaller in scope but rich in emotional detail, the sort of work that could carve space for itself between louder releases. The tone of its marketing reflected the story it carried. Restrained, human, focused not on scale but on character. From the very beginning, the way it presented itself aligned with what it was inside. A piece of cinema that lived through performance, atmosphere, and honesty. Early confidence would have felt fragile but essential, a quiet assurance that the film deserved to exist, that its scale was manageable and its heart undeniable. Later confidence, by contrast, came not from vision but from evidence. Once cast was in place, once rehearsals revealed the nuance in performances, once scenes began to take shape in dailies, the belief grew steadier. What began as faith shifted into momentum. Commitments that had felt hesitant at first became firmer as progress became visible, the sense of a story worth telling now embodied in faces, voices, and captured images. This rhythm, early fragility turning into late solidity, colored the way the film moved forward. At the start, every choice must have felt tentative, as though one misstep could unravel fragile trust. By the middle, the trust had matured into patience, giving the team room to lean into silences, to let moments breathe, confident that the work was bearing fruit. The timing of this rhythm shaped the experience on set. Early days carried the pressure of proof. Crews worked under the weight of expectation, knowing that every scene was more than just a piece of a whole. It was evidence that the project could hold together. That pressure might have quickened pace, shortened patience, made planning tight and rigid. Later, when confidence deepened, the atmosphere would have relaxed. There was more room for adjustment, for experimentation, for trusting the actors to stretch a silence a little longer or for the camera to hold on a look rather than rushing on. The arc of support gave the production its own emotional pulse, tense beginnings easing into steadier confidence as progress became undeniable. This sense of timing would also have influenced morale. When backing feels precarious, everyone notices. Actors feel it in the urgency to deliver something undeniable, crew members feel it in the pressure to avoid mistakes, and directors feel it in the weight of every choice. Planning becomes narrow, schedules tight, as though the film must prove itself daily just to survive. As confidence grows, morale shifts with it. Scenes are approached with more patience, setbacks absorbed without panic. The atmosphere on set loosens into something closer to trust. The rhythm of support becomes a silent partner in the production, its ebb and flow mirrored in the energy of the crew. The feeling of waiting shaped the project as much as movement. Support often arrives not in a single moment but in staggered intervals, requiring pauses between pushes forward. Those pauses on this film must have carried their own tension. While waiting, plans could only stretch so far. While moving, energy had to be concentrated to make up for lost time. That alternating rhythm, pause, push, pause again, became part of the lived experience of production. Everyone had to adjust, to settle into the quiet of waiting for the next stage of faith to arrive, then to lunge forward with urgency when it finally did. This rhythm was not neutral, it colored the creative choices. A director working under the shadow of fragile early faith leans on clarity, avoids indulgence, pushes to show strength quickly. Later, when faith has solidified, the same director might dare to hold a shot longer, to let actors explore silences, to trust the story's small details. Crew members, too, feel the difference. In early stages, each setup is approached with heightened focus, mistakes costly. Later, efficiency grows from confidence, adjustments made without fear, experiments tried without anxiety. The machinery of filmmaking responds to the flow of confidence, shaping not just pace but the emotional texture of every day on set. In the end, the film carries this rhythm within it. The early urgency is visible in scenes that strike with clarity, quickly defining relationships, showing the stakes with precision. The later relaxation is visible in stretches of quiet, where tension simmers unhurried, where the camera lingers, trusting the audience to sit inside discomfort. The rhythm of financing and timing leaves its imprint on the narrative itself, not as a detail of contracts or paperwork, but as a living pulse in the film's pacing, its atmosphere, and its energy. The sense of waiting, moving, adjusting, and pushing forward became the invisible current beneath its surface, guiding it from fragile beginnings to a completed work that still feels intimate, immediate, and alive. At its most ambitious, The film aimed to show the turbulence of a boy's coming of age not through sweeping gestures but through the weight of ordinary life pressed hard against him. Its scale of ambition was inward, emotional, grounded in the way silence can cut deeper than words and how a slammed door can carry more violence than a gunfight. This was never a film trying to fill a screen with noise or spectacle. Its ambition was to immerse the viewer in the textures of a lived experience, to capture the way hope and despair coexist within the same household. On screen, this comes across in the way the camera refuses to look away from conflict, lingering just long enough for discomfort to settle in the viewer's chest. That is where the story wanted to be bold. By demanding attention to things often at the same time, there was conscious restraint. The film could have stretched toward broader contexts, showing more of the outside world, framing the boy's life as part of a larger cultural or political landscape. But that choice was held back. Instead, the world remains intimate, reduced to rooms, roads, and fragments of everyday environments. That restraint made sense because the story itself is about being trapped in close quarters, about lives shaped more by immediate surroundings than by distant forces. Expanding too far outward would have diluted the intensity of what happens inside the home, inside the car, inside the silence between words. By holding back, the film remained true to its own pulse. The trade-offs that kept the story readable were constant. Longer sequences of conflict could have been staged with greater ferocity, but that might have pushed the tone into melodrama. Instead, arguments are cut with silences, confrontations framed by stillness, making the eruptions feel sharper precisely because they are not endless. Locations are limited, but this limitation makes each setting resonate more deeply. The kitchen becomes more than a room. It becomes a recurring arena of struggle, its table and chairs charged with tension by repetition. These choices created trade-offs, less variety in backdrop, but more weight each time a familiar space reappears. The effect on tone was decisive. By narrowing its scope, the film maintained a consistent atmosphere of pressure. The pacing reflects this. Instead of racing from scene to scene, it settles into moments, allowing tension to build slowly, almost unbearably. The lack of sprawling set pieces means the rhythm never splinters. Everything is tied to the emotional core. The viewer is not carried along by twists or spectacle but by a steady tightening of the emotional rope, one knot at a time. The film breathes in discomfort and exhales in fleeting moments of reprieve, its scope shaping the cadence of the entire narrative. Within the team, optimism mixed with caution in equal measure. There was pride that the film was being received as the work they had hoped to make, pride that its restraint was understood as strength rather than weakness. At the same time, there was awareness that early chatter can fade quickly if not supported, that audiences willing to recommend such a heavy story had to do so with conviction. The balance between optimism and resolve became the tone of the days that followed. Optimism, because the first signals were genuine. Resolve, because sustaining that kind of momentum would take patience and persistence. By the end of the weekend, the film's trajectory felt visible, even if not yet certain. It was not destined for instant domination, but it had carved out a place for itself. The conversations it sparked, the weight of its performances, the loyalty of those who responded to its honesty, all suggested that the weeks ahead would not be about sudden leaps but about steady steps. For the team, that was enough. After the uncertainty of waiting, after the tension of the first reveal, they now had something tangible, a sense that the film would live, that it had entered the bloodstream of its audience, and that its journey had only just begun. As the film began to move outward into the wider current of release, it entered a rhythm that felt both ordinary and quietly demanding. Nothing about this stage was glamorous. It was a matter of passing through layers, each step a necessary transition, each one adding time before the film could reach its audience in full. These were the layers every project encounters. The practical hands that shape a finished work into something deliverable, the scheduling steps that place it where it belongs, the routines of circulation that are rarely noticed from the outside. From within, the team understood this road well. It was not dramatic, but it was steady, a sequence of stages that had to be accepted with patience. The frictions built into this journey were ordinary and expected. Delays in moving copies from one place to another, minor questions over format or timing, the subtle adjustments required to make the film fit into an already crowded landscape, all of these became part of the lived experience. No one was surprised by them. They were as much a part of the process as rehearsals had been during production. But that did not make them invisible. For those inside the project, every pause was felt, every adjustment required attention. The forward movement of the film was steady but rarely smooth. It was like watching a train slow at each station, knowing it would continue but aware of the time lost with every stop. This stage was marked by a certain tension between perception and understanding. From the outside, it looked simple. The film was finished, it was released, it was now in theaters or making its way across regions. From within, the reality was slower and more layered. Each step required confirmation, sign-offs, coordination. Audiences saw only the arrival, the team lived through the crawl that preceded it. That difference in perspective shaped the mood. Viewers expected immediacy, the team settled into patience. They knew outcomes could not be rushed, that the road was built on slow, careful progress rather than sudden leaps. For those involved, there was a calm acknowledgement of the process. By this point, the rush of production and the nerves of opening weekend had given way to a steadier rhythm. This was not the stage for dramatic decisions or emotional highs. It was the stage of waiting, of watching the film circulate, of recognizing that much was now out of their hands. Conversations shifted from the creative to the logistical, from performances to schedules. It was less about shaping the film and more about shepherding it through the channels already set in place. This shift carried its own emotional tone. There was less exhilaration, but also less anxiety. The team had lived through the uncertainty of whether the film would connect, and now they were living through the inevitability of process. Each deduction, each slice taken from what the film earned as it moved outward, was part of the reality they had expected from the beginning. No one was surprised by the layers between effort and return. They had always known that what reached them would be reduced, that each stage would take its part. The calm came from acceptance. This was the ordinary weight of distribution, nothing more, nothing less. Inside the project, the lived experience of this stage felt like settling into the long middle stretch of a journey. The adrenaline was gone, but so was the fear of collapse. What remained was endurance. Each week brought the same cycle of updates, each report carried the same pattern of deductions. No one mistook this stage for failure. It was simply the cost of movement, the price of circulation. There was even a certain relief in the normalcy of it. The film was not derailed, not struggling. It was simply moving along the path everyone had anticipated. The public perception, meanwhile, was far simpler. Viewers saw posters, showings, articles, or perhaps heard word of mouth, and that was all. They engaged with the film directly, never aware of the machinery behind its presence. To them, it either existed in their city or it did not, it either showed up on a screen or it was absent. The deductions, the frictions, the waiting, all were invisible. Only those within the project carried that weight, watching as each ordinary step chipped away at the whole, while the world outside noticed only the surface by the time this stage stretched into its later weeks, the calm of routine had settled in fully. The team no longer rode waves of uncertainty, they rode a steady tide, knowing the film's place, acknowledging its process, accepting what was taken along the way. There was no illusion that this stage would yield sudden revelations. It was about completion, about guiding the film through its path until outcomes became clear. The waiting was no longer tense but measured. The story they had worked to tell was now carried by channels larger than themselves, and the only task left was patience. In the weeks after its first run, the film's path settled into something quieter, more reflective, a phase less about noise and more about endurance. Profit, in this case, was never going to be defined by a surge or a spectacular leap. It revealed itself slowly, in the steady trickle of returns that reflected the kind of story being told. This was not a film built for flash. It was built for persistence, for the kind of recognition that accumulates rather than erupts. From the inside, that rhythm shaped how Aftermath was experienced, less like a celebration and more like a release, the long exhale after months of tension. The sense of gain, when it arrived, was measured in confidence rather than abundance. Each confirmation that the film had found its audience, that it had carried itself with dignity through the noise of larger, louder projects, brought relief. For those who had lived inside the making of it, profit was not just what was returned but what was proven, that a restrained, intimate story could stand on its own. That validation mattered more than numbers. It was a signal that the gamble of restraint, the gamble of placing trust in performances rather than spectacle, had been worth it. The aftermath was colored by quiet pride. Cast and crew looked back on the long days in confined sets, the patience demanded of every department, the weight of small details carried across weeks of work. To see that effort reflected in an audience's response, even a modest one, was to see endurance rewarded. The atmosphere was not triumphant but grateful, marked by the knowledge that the story now belonged to viewers. The film had moved beyond the circle of its makers, becoming something that lived in memory, in conversation, in reflection. For some, the aftermath also carried a touch of melancholy. The intensity of production, the closeness of the team, the shared pressure of turning silence and conflict into drama, all of that dissolved once the film had completed its journey outward. What remained was absence, the sudden quiet that always follows when a project ends. That quiet can feel heavier when the film itself is so tied to weight and discomfort, when its mood lingers long after cameras stop rolling. Yet even in that heaviness there was satisfaction. The film had captured what it set out to capture. Profit was also felt in reputational terms. The actors, particularly those at the center, carried forward new recognition, their performances singled out as the heart of the film. For them, the aftermath meant opportunities, new paths opening because of the strength of what they delivered here. For the crew, the profit was measured in resilience, proof that they could hold a project together within tight boundaries, that their patience with small details had been worthwhile. For the director, it was vindication, that the choice to hold back, to trust restraint, had not been weakness but vision. From a broader perspective, the aftermath revealed how the film's identity endured. It did not vanish once its initial run ended. It settled into memory, into conversation, into the quiet recognition that this was a story worth carrying forward. Some films fade as quickly as they arrive. This one lingered. That lingering was itself a form of profit, one that could not be measured in immediate returns but in endurance over years. The story became part of the larger fabric of cinema from its era, recalled not for spectacle but for sincerity. Within the team, reflection deepened over time. Looking back, they could see the trade-offs more clearly, the way scope had been narrowed, ambition balanced against constraint, patience rewarded by persistence. They could see that the aftermath was shaped as much by process as by product. The film had not soared instantly, but it had survived steadily, and in that survival there was strength. The profits, emotional, reputational, financial, were modest, but they were real, anchored in the same truth that had guided the film from the beginning. Small things matter when they are done with care. In the end, the aftermath felt less like a closing and more like a quiet continuation. The film lived on in the reputations it helped shape, in the viewers who carried it in memory, in the proof it provided that intimacy and restraint could stand alongside grandeur and noise. Its journey from conception to release, through doubt and patience, into persistence and memory, became a reminder that not every film needs to overwhelm to endure. Some survive by whispering instead of shouting, and that whisper, in time, becomes its own kind of legacy. Looking back at the way this film took shape, there are choices that rise to the surface as quiet victories. One of them was the decision to let the story remain tightly bound to its interiors, refusing the temptation to widen its reach into arenas it did not need. This choice gave the film its pressure. In kitchens, bedrooms, cars, and small-town backdrops, the intimacy sharpened every exchange. When the boy sits at the table, shoulders tight under the gaze of an authority figure, the confined space itself becomes a weapon. The decision to keep returning to such settings meant that tension accumulated rather than scattered. By narrowing its field, the film intensified its grip, and in doing so, it gave the performances room to dominate. The camera was not distracted by spectacle. It was forced to look closely at faces, at silences, at the small cracks of resistance in a child's eyes. That restraint turned what might have been diffuse into something cutting. Another choice that helped was the trust placed in performance over plot mechanics. The film could have leaned into dramatizing events at the cost of subtlety, building conflict around external twists. Instead, it chose to linger on the way cruelty is delivered in offhand remarks, or how kindness appears in fleeting gestures. This approach shifted the weight from what happens to how it feels when it happens. One scene where the boys' attempts to find warmth are met with cold dismissal carries more force than a dozen larger confrontations might. By letting the actors carry the burden, the film found authenticity. That authenticity became its anchor, convincing the audience to endure discomfort because it felt so deeply real, but alongside these strengths were frictions that pulled at the fabric of the project. One came from its very restraint. By choosing to remain so closely tied to a few spaces, the film occasionally risked repetition. Viewers could feel the walls as much as the characters did, and while that was deliberate, it carried the danger of narrowing variety. For those making it, the obstacle was how to keep familiar spaces fresh across weeks of shooting and across 2 hours of story. The answer often lay in light, in performance, in pacing, but the risk was always present. On set, it must have felt like wrestling with the same walls day after day, adjusting angles and moods in search of nuance. That friction did not undo the film, but it left its mark in stretches that feel heavier, almost weighed down by their own confinement. Another obstacle lay in timing. The film's rhythm of support came in pulses rather than a steady flow, with confidence fragile in the early stages and steadier only once progress became visible. That unevenness shaped both production and release. It meant the team worked under shadows at first, carrying the anxiety of proving themselves daily. It meant that choices had to be made quickly, sometimes without the luxury of patient revision. The pivot toward greater trust only came later, after the work had already been done under tight watch. For those inside the process, this created a dual memory, the pride of what was achieved, but also the exhaustion of having to fight for every inch early on. That lived difficulty clings to the story's atmosphere, a reminder that the path was never smooth. From these threads emerges a pattern worth noticing. The film's endurance came not from scale but from concentration, placing all of its weight on performance, mood, and authenticity. That pattern suggests a lesson for future projects. When the material carries intimacy at its core, expanding outward dilutes it, but doubling down on detail allows it to cut deeper. This is not advice, but an observation from what unfolded here. The choice to concentrate created both strength and risk. Strength because it sharpened the emotional blade. Risk because it tested patience and variety. What to carry forward is the knowledge that concentration itself becomes the battleground, shaping everything from morale on set to the way audiences breathe with a story. In the quiet of its aftermath, the film leaves more than memory. It leaves an impression of how patience and precision can define a work more than noise ever could. It shows how confinement can serve as both weapon and weight, how trust in actors can transform restraint into strength, how uneven faith in a project can wound morale but also sharpen resolve. These are not lessons in abstraction but reflections etched into the lived experience of this film's making. To step back from it is to see a path defined not by triumph alone but by the balance of clarity and friction, each necessary, each visible on the screen. And so the film closes its own circle with a kind of quiet clarity. It was never meant to be loud, never meant to overwhelm. Its path was measured, its risks deliberate, its strength born of focus. What it leaves behind is not only the story within its frames but the story of its creation. A tale of restraint held firm, of difficulties endured, of a vision preserved through patience. In that balance lies its true legacy, not the spectacle of its release, but the endurance of its truth.